Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to these plenary sessions. We're going to be hearing a number of outstanding keynote addresses here in this last session, which takes place before our memorial this evening for the worldwide victims of terror. I would like to introduce Arndt von Loringhoven, the Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security at NATO. Arndt Freitag von Loringhoven is NATO's first Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security. He took up his post on the 1st of December 2016. He's responsible for providing intelligence support to the North Atlantic Council and the Military Committee, as well as for advising the Secretary General on intelligence and security matters. His tasks include setting up the new joint division and thus merging NATO's civilian and military intelligence strands. Prior to his appointment as Assistant Secretary General, he served as German ambassador to the Czech Republic. He graduated from the New College at Oxford in 1980 with an MA and earned a PhD degree from the Max Planck Institute for Biochemistry in Martinsried, Germany in 1984. He joined the German Foreign Ministry in 1986. Having served at the German embassies in Paris and Moscow, he also held various posts in the Foreign Ministry, such as member of the Policy Planning Staff, speechwriter of the Minister, European correspondent, and Director of European Affairs. And from 2007 to 2010, he was the Vice President of the German Intelligence Service. So I am pretty sure we're going to be hearing a very interesting presentation here, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's my first time at this conference, and I must say I found it absolutely fascinating this morning to listen to the analyses. And thank you for your interest in NATO and NATO's role in the fight against terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's globalized world, the NATO alliance must simultaneously monitor and assess a multitude of different threats. The most important ones, very briefly, I would name as conventional military threats, hybrid warfare, and international terrorism. Of course, there are many others, but these are really in the forefront of our interests and activities. But let me focus exclusively on the terrorist threats, on how we see them, and what NATO's role is in fighting terrorism. And there's probably more than many of you may know or may have seen. From NATO's perspective, the overall security situation has become ever more complex, and in order to successfully address today's challenges, we must maintain a very high level of flexibility to adjust to changing realities. And I would say this is particularly true in the past 4 years, since 2014. And I'm saying that because of the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea on the one hand, and the emergence of ISIL-Daesh as a global threat, really. NATO has many years of counter-terrorism experience, and in recent years has taken an increasingly active role in this area, both on the direct action side of CT, counter-terrorism, and on the softer side as well, where we focus on helping partners build the capabilities to counter threats within their own borders. So what are the key threats from a NATO perspective that we currently face? Very much in the forefront has been ISIL-Daesh. And as you all know, last year ISIL-Daesh experienced significant territorial losses in Iraq and Syria, and is now close to total territorial defeat. However, despite these losses, and I generally agree very much with the picture that emerged from the great panel before lunch, the group was able actually to execute more terrorist attacks. Our number is 4,612 worldwide than any other extremist group. And in terms of percentages, the number of terrorist attacks conducted globally decreased by 22% last year. However, the number of ISIL-Daesh attacks rose by almost 9%. So the threat is by no means over, and sometimes the almost total territorial defeat may create that impression, but that is certainly not at all true. These numbers demonstrate one thing, that terrorist groups are able to adjust their modus operandi in a relatively short time. Throughout late 2016 and 2017, senior ISIL-Daesh leaders adapted the organization to new realities by, for example, granting greater autonomy to its branches and regional affiliates. And we estimate that ISIL-Daesh still has around 30,000 members in Iraq and Syria, and I know this is a number that was recently also stated by the UN. We estimate that of these roughly 30,000, 18 to 20,000 are still fighters. So this is really a very high number, and it's around 50% of the peak number, which was, I think, 39,000 foreign fighters in Iraq and in Syria. Their main areas of operations are Kirkuk and Nineveh provinces, Al-Anbar, Salah al-Din in Iraq, and along the middle Euphrates River Valley and the eastern desert in Syria. But really the large majority of these people have gone underground and are now in other parts of Syria and Iraq. And much like Al-Qaeda, ISIL-Daesh is transforming from a centralized hierarchical structure into a decentralized ideological movement. We are observing with great concern that despite intense efforts by the international community to defeat ISIL-Daesh, the ideological power of the group and its ability to inspire individuals has not diminished. For example, in 2017, we noted a shift away from directed, more complex attacks towards more inspired attacks, in which so-called lone wolves, motivated by ISIL-Daesh, but who do not have any direct contact with the group, carry out acts of terror. While these attacks have proven less sophisticated and caused fewer casualties, their terrorizing effect has nevertheless been very significant. And to facilitate this transition, ISIL-Daesh has adapted its propaganda and recruitment tactics with a clear focus on inciting individuals to conduct attacks in their home countries. This group uses social media platforms, continuously working on their cyber capabilities to reach and recruit potential sympathizers. Now, a very worrisome trend is the group's concerted effort to use propaganda to radicalize women and minors who have emerged as a new target group for recruitment relatively recently. This trend may have led to increased involvement of women and minors in the planning and execution of a number of attacks, including in NATO countries. The role of women within ISIL-Daesh structures used to be more or less restricted to the home, with the exception of recruitment activities, which women within ISIL-Daesh engaged in from the onset of the establishment of the caliphate. However, since 2016, women have taken on more operational roles within ISIL Daesh. For example, there has been a marked increase in the number of female suicide bombers and women taking on more operational roles in recruitment and social media activities. And equally, we are seeing ISIL Daesh increasingly targeting children and minors in their propaganda and their indoctrination efforts, particularly the children of ISIL Daesh members and supporters, or women and children returning from Iraq and Syria, could constitute the next generation of extremists. Minors returning from ISIL Daesh-held areas likely experienced lengthy exposure to the group's ideology and experienced psychological traumata. This makes them both victims and potential perpetrators. Given these developments, it is increasingly important to understand the factors that can make an individual vulnerable to radicalization. And this, of course, is a very complex task, as there is no single path to terrorism and consequently no model to predict who will become radicalized. The potential threat of foreign fighters returning to NATO member nations is, of course, a particular concern to us and has been widely discussed. And many actually anticipated a higher number of foreign fighters returning from Iraq and Syria to Europe and North America, a so-called starburst effect. That didn't happen to the extent that was predicted by many, but I would still argue that the number of foreign terrorist fighters that have returned already is still very significant and very dangerous. And even a smaller number of returnees who are highly trained and have battlefield experience are a potentially very significant threat and can strengthen local or homegrown terrorist networks. We are also seeing movements from Iraq and Syria to other theaters, to other places, Sinai, for instance, in smaller numbers, Afghanistan in slightly higher numbers. Now, while those numbers are relatively small, we also judge that individuals who are motivated to continue fighting after what they have experienced in Iraq and Syria in another theater are amongst the most committed and hardened and therefore dangerous fighters. Looking ahead, we are much concerned with the terrorists' potential use of commercially available technologies such as drones and electronics. And since the end of 2016, we have observed increasingly sophisticated weaponized commercial drones being used in Iraq and Syria. And terrorists demonstrated use of armed, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, in theaters of operation remain a very acute concern, especially since extremists could misuse UAV technologies in a similar way against civilians inside NATO countries too. We are also concerned that terrorists could attempt to execute an attack with an explosive device that is undetectable by X-ray and could be detonated remotely using a cell phone. NATO has undertaken efforts to address the misuse of drones, so we've started to do that. We provide multiple frameworks to support capability development for countering terrorists' misuse of UAVs, including within the armaments, science and technology, and industry communities. So far, terrorists have not used chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear, so-called CBRN, weapons to the extent predicted and feared. However, concern is rising over the threat of attacks employing chemical or biological substances. Terrorist groups aim to gain chemical, biological capabilities, and unfortunately these agents can be difficult for security forces to detect due to their, not least due to their varying nature. And a recent case in Point, you've probably all have noted this, was the discovery of ricin in my own country in an apartment in Cologne, Germany, where a Tunisian man suspected to have been inspired by ISIL Daesh was arrested. He had acquired over 3,000 castor beans and had already turned some of them into ricin. This case illustrates the threat of bioterrorism in Europe, and in the first case of a suspected terrorist successfully producing a toxic biological agent in Europe. Acquiring nuclear materials remains much more difficult. Some terrorist organizations have attempted to manufacture dirty bombs. ISIL Daesh supporters, for example, which involve using conventional explosives to disperse radioactive material and contaminate a wide area. Now, in general, ISIL Daesh and its affiliates continue to be the most potent terrorist threat to global security, despite a marked decrease in fatalities associated with ISIL Daesh attacks due to the group's increased focus on low-cost, low-tech attacks instead of complex attacks. We expect the trend of inspired low-cost, low-tax attacks to continue, posing a particular challenge because these types of attacks require little to no communications, training, planning, and other red flags that typically provide indicators and warning of a potential attack, and that's what makes them so particularly dangerous. However, and I was glad there was a lot of mention of Al-Qaeda this morning. ISIL Daesh's weakening has provided Al-Qaeda with an opportunity to attempt to regain its former status. While ISIL Daesh has occupied the world's attention for the last 4 to 5 years, Al-Qaeda has been quietly rebuilding its global networks and capabilities. It has established, for example, a new affiliate in Kashmir. It has resurged in Afghanistan, and the group has fortified and expanded its presence in Syria, in Yemen, of course, in Somalia, and in large parts of North Africa. Therefore, we certainly must not underestimate Al-Qaeda, as it clearly seeks to benefit from the weakening of ISIL Daesh, and also accordingly has recently increased its propaganda activities, rather like ISIL Daesh. Al-Qaeda's strategic aim is to regain leadership over like-minded militants and extremists. The competition for legitimacy, affiliates, and recruits among the two major global extremist groups potentially increases the terrorism threat to NATO and our partners. And now I would like to say a few words about what NATO does, how NATO is involved in fighting terrorism. Now, on the harder direct action side, the alliance has been active since at least 2001, when NATO's Article 5 was invoked for the first and only time in history in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And this led to NATO's ISAF mission. excuse me, which has meanwhile been succeeded by the Resolute Support mission with over 16,000 personnel still from NATO member states and partner countries deployed in Afghanistan. While ISAF was a combat mission, Resolute Support is a training and assistance mission that helps to build capacity of Afghan national security and defense institutions. Much of this assistance is designed to help the government of Afghanistan more effectively fight terrorism and ensure stability so that it will never again become a safe haven for international terrorists. NATO has also worked to ensure that when actively engaged in CT operations, our troops have the right tools to protect themselves and also local populations. For instance, we established the Defense Against Terrorism program of work in 2005 to develop technologies and capabilities to protect troops and civilians from non-conventional attacks. Although the alliance does not perform a combat role in the efforts to defeat ISIL-Daesh, NATO decided to become a full member of the global coalition to defeat ISIL-Daesh just over a year ago in May 2017. And of course, it provides support through the deployment of NATO AWACS aircraft. NATO's role within the global coalition to defeat ISIS will evolve as the coalition moves from combat operations to stabilization efforts. And in terms of enhancing our engagement with partner countries and international actors, NATO has unique strengths that make us a valuable contributor. In particular, we aim for the highest level of professionalism within our militaries. Many nations understand this and seek partnership with NATO, which gives us a unique opportunity to project stability, that is the term we use, project stability into regions of concern. And some of our particular strengths lie in civilian military crossover areas, such as capabilities to counter asymmetric attacks, standards to enable interoperability, training and advice on crisis management and civil emergency planning, and assistance on security and defense sector reforms. Recognizing these strengths, in May last year, the heads of states and governments of NATO met in Brussels and adopted an action plan, a comprehensive action plan to enhance the alliance's role in the international community's fight against terrorism. There are many areas covered here which range from awareness and analysis to operations, governance, and strategic communications. NATO training and capacity building in Iraq exemplifies how we have leveraged our strengths to assist an important partner in the fight against terrorism. We assist the Iraqi government in countering improvised explosive devices, civil military planning, civil emergency planning, security sector reform. And building on these activities at the most recent NATO summit in July, Allied leaders launched a non-combat training and capacity building mission in Iraq. So a wider mission than we have had before, which will provide additional support to Iraq's efforts to stabilize the country and to fight terrorism. Now, this decision has been taken, and now we are starting to implement this mission. NATO also has undertaken steps to enhance its engagement with many other international actors. First and foremost, I would highlight the European Union. We continue to coordinate and synchronize our efforts with the EU to fill critical gaps and to reduce redundancies and ensure coherence. Many of the threats to NATO apply equally to the EU. Furthermore, there's a Mediterranean dialogue that was launched in 1994, and we have been developing relationships with the African Union, with the G5, and the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, to name just a few. Now, one or two words about what I do myself. And I'm glad it was mentioned already before. The changing security environment has made it necessary to increase our cooperation in the intelligence and security field. So 2 years ago, Allied leaders decided to create an 8th division at headquarters, the Joint Intelligence and Security Division. It's also the first completely fused military and civilian division, and I started my job on the 1st of December 2016, and my first mission was to actually stand up this new division and ensure that it starts working well. We do so-called strategic intelligence in my division at headquarters. So this is not about tactical or operational, but it's really the bigger trends where things are going. And we also don't collect our own intelligence, but we receive intelligence from our member states, and our main job is to come up with a fused intelligence picture. And I'm almost through. Maybe 2 more sentences, if I may.
Is this NATO time or ICT time?
NATO time. And let me just finish by mentioning one project which is on biometrics. NATO has been collecting biometric data in operational theaters, that is by military force protection, and we have developed a new policy which will make it possible to share biometric data also with civilian actors, with civilian intelligence services and police. This is actually technically and legally quite complicated, and we're very glad that we've been able to expand our activities in this area. So thank you very much for your attention.
Arndt, I want to thank you for your comprehensive overview of all of the great things NATO is doing to try to counter terrorism in the region, and for your input and for your assessment. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Major General Reserves Yaakov Amidror. He's the former National Security Advisor and Director of the National Security Council for the State of Israel. Major General Reserves Yaakov Amidror is the former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel and the head of National Security. Major General Reserves Amidror served in senior IDF posts for 36 years, including commander of the military colleges, military secretary to the Minister of Defense, director of the Intelligence Analysis Division in Military Intelligence, and chief intelligence officer of the Northern Command. He's authored 3 books on intelligence and military strategy. I suggest you take out your notebooks and pens, pencils, and write down what Major General Yaakov Amidror has to say. He is very to the point, very, very focused, very matter of fact, and we can all learn a lot from Amidror. Amidror, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I was told that I'm speaking Hebrew, and I take the opportunity. But I can hear, if you want to ask questions in English or whatever, it's okay. I can speak both languages. Not. I'll begin with English because I want, first of all, to thank Mr. Mladenov is here, and the Prime Minister is speaking afterwards about the Bulgarian authorities for the cooperation after the terror event in Burgos, which was done by Hezbollah, and the government of Bulgaria didn't hesitate. They make all the investigations and they found the terrorists. They took care very impressively to the Israelis who were there, to the families of those who had been killed or injured. I saw the pressure that they have to face and how successfully they succeeded to manage between all these forces at the end of the day to bring the killers into court. I don't know why, I'm not familiar with the today details, but I heard that Hezbollah is not mentioned at all in the court. The prosecutor decided that, I don't know, it's a group of scout members who met some Jews in Burgos in an accident. Hezbollah doesn't exist. And in a way, this is the problem with Europe. When we asked the Europeans to designate Hezbollah as a terror organization, it took us time. And at the end of the day, the Europeans decided, yes, we will do it, with a lot of help from the information that we got from Bulgaria after the operation. And we found at the end that what was designated as terror organization is the military branch of Hezbollah, which with all due respect does not exist. There is no military branch in Hezbollah. Nasrallah is in the operational level, in the strategic level, in the political level. There is no any differentiation between political and military. Not at the end of the day and not at the beginning of the day. And we ask our friends in Europe what happened. Why did they innovate something which does not exist to be designated as terror organization? And the answer was very interesting. They told us that if they designate Hezbollah as a terror organization, they cannot work with the government of Lebanon, because Hezbollah is part of the government. According to the European rules, they cannot work with any body in which there is a terror organization as a member. So if they designate Hezbollah as a terror organization, they cannot work with the Lebanese government. This is why they have to innovate something which does not exist and to designate it so they can continue to work with the Lebanese government. And who is member of the military wing of Hezbollah? The answer is no one, because there is no military wing of Hezbollah. So they did all the work. Hezbollah military wing was designated as a terror organization. But who is there? None. If you want to understand our problem fighting terrorism and cooperating with Europeans and others relating to terror, war against terror, this is a very good example of how they try to go doing something and at the same time doing nothing. Of course, when it is coming to terrorists inside Europe, they are more active, but when it is Hezbollah, which is active only against Jews, not only Israelis. Remember, they blow the building of the Jewish community in Buenos Aires. It's not Israelis. It's pure Argentinians citizens. So if you look at our cooperation, we have to understand that there are some issues in which we cannot cooperate because the other side, mainly the Europeans, are not ready to face the reality, to call the reality, and to work based on the real reality. And this is one example. What is the uniqueness of the terror threat that we are facing here in Israel? First, unlike many terror organizations or operations in some cases, including Al-Qaeda in Brussels or France, we are facing terror organizations which have in mind the destruction and the elimination of the State of Israel, which with all due respect, these cells of Al-Qaeda or ISIS do not have when they act in Europe or America or wherever. We are facing different kind of terror which has in mind and prepare itself and doing everything which is needed to destroy Israel, to eliminate the Jewish state in the Middle East. It's a huge difference. Wider aims for the terror that we are facing. Second, it's done by organizations which are becoming more and more like military systems. It's very true about Hezbollah. You know, with 120,000 rockets and missiles. Do you know about other terror organization who has such a number of weapon systems? Anti-air missiles, anti-ship missiles, drones, and so on and so forth. Yes, they don't have aeroplanes yet, or helicopters. But they are becoming more and more like military organization. It's true about Hamas, with less degree. They don't have what Hezbollah has, but slowly they are building it. Will they succeed to reach the level of Hezbollah? I have many doubts. If Egypt will continue to do the job to isolate the strip from one side, and we will continue to do it from the other side, and we will not be backed, and we will not be pressed by the world to let free entrance into the Gaza Strip, they will not reach the level of Hezbollah, but slowly they are gaining more and more capabilities. And if we have to attack Hamas inside the Strip, they are more organized than many other military systems in the Middle East today. And the number of kilometers of tunnels that they have under Gaza, it's huge. And with all due respect, it's not a terror organization, it's more military, sub-military organization, which is different from what the Europeans are facing relating to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so on and so forth. ISIS never reached the level of militarization and capabilities that Hezbollah has today in Lebanon. And this is because these organizations are supported by countries. It's not just a terror organization. Hezbollah is an extension of Iran. The Iranians support Hezbollah as part of their own capabilities. The weapon systems which had been moved by the Syrians to the hand of Hezbollah are the most sophisticated weapon systems that had been produced by the Syrians in Syria also, or had been supplied by the Russians to the Syrians. When you are facing an organization which behind it there are countries, states with all their capabilities, and they are ready to support the organization with all the newest and most sophisticated weapon system, it's a different situation. And this is the situation of Hezbollah today. And if Iran will not be contained tomorrow, and this is why what we are facing is not the classical terror organization. Yes, when they act in Burgos, it's a classical terror organization. But you have to remember this is only one part and not the strongest one of Hezbollah. The third issue, which is very unique, those organizations although they are not states, they are acting like states. In Lebanon, they took the sovereignty of Lebanon under their own control. You heard they brought a weapon system through civil flights into the Lebanese airport. In South Lebanon, there is no any chance that no one will do anything, even move something without permission of Hezbollah. The Lebanese, you know, someone said that Lebanon is not a state, it's a constitution. And within this constitution of today, no one will act in Lebanon without getting permission from the Hezbollah. And you know, the Americans and the French are saying we will encourage the Lebanese army, we will support the Lebanese army with new weapon systems so it will be stronger than it. You understand? It's not connected to reality. At the end of the day, the Lebanese army is one arm of Hezbollah and will cooperate with Hezbollah in any operation against Israel. Formally, Hezbollah is built, part of its capabilities, on the capabilities of the Lebanese army. So all those who are speaking about encouraging the Lebanese army and promoting its capabilities, at the end of the day it means stronger Hezbollah. So it's, you know, it's a situation in which totally different from in the past, because those organizations, even if they are not the state, like in Gaza, in which Hamas is the state, they are hosted by a state which had been taken by the organization and this organization is making all the decisions for the government. So then it is a very strange situation in which a member of the United Nations called Lebanon is hosting an organization which was designated by the European Union and by the United States of America and other countries as a terror organization, and at the end of the day, everyone understands that those who are making the decisions in Lebanon are not the Lebanese government officials, but the Hezbollah members. How you deal with it? And this is one of the uniqueness of the terror that we are facing. And at the end of the day, we should not forget Hezbollah is a terror organization. And last but not least, these are organizations with a lot of support from the outside. Qatar is giving a lot of money to Hamas. Turkey is supporting Hamas. Iran is supporting Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah. Mr. Corbyn in London is speaking very favorably about his friends in Hamas and his brothers in Hezbollah. And this is London. It's part of the West. Yeah, I'm not speaking about not mentioning, of course, Iran, Qatar, and so on and so forth. So it's a situation in which leaders and countries encouraging organizations which are practically terror organizations and encourage them to continue in their way. And we have to face these organizations to see how can we fight with them. What is the meaning of all that? What are the lessons for us? First, and most important than anything else, we came to the stage in which we have to prevent these organizations, mainly Hamas, to be stronger, to stop the support of Iran and Syria to Hezbollah. And if will be a need to go to a big war to eliminate the military capabilities of Hezbollah and to prevent continuation of this support of Iran to Hezbollah. This is what we are doing now in Syria, and slowly it will go also about Lebanon. Because the amount of capabilities they are buying and they are getting from Iran in Syria is in a level in which it is endanger our ability to stop it in the future. And we should not let it go without making whatever is needed to stop it. And when I say whenever is needed, that Israel should be ready to go to a big war to stop this building of capabilities of Hezbollah in Lebanon and what the Iranians are doing in Syria. This is the most critical decision that Israel should take. I believe that we should take it and take the risk of going to a big war, including against the 120,000 rockets and missiles of Hezbollah. And it should be done. Otherwise, if we not stop the building of these capabilities in both Syria and Lebanon, Israel might find itself in a situation in which we don't have solution to the threat which was emerged very close to Israel. Remember, we don't have a border with Iran. Tehran, the Iranian border from Israel is 1,200 kilometers. But the Iranians have a border with Israel. Iranian forces, an Iranian extension organization called Hezbollah is 100 kilometers from the center of Israel. So the Iranians have the capabilities to launch attack on Israel 150 kilometers from the center of Israel, and Israel is 1,500 kilometers from Tehran. And the meaning of it, that at the end of the day, we should be in a position and with the determination that if that will be used against Israel, we should not make the mistake that the Saudis did. What happened in Yemen? The Iranians are launching rockets and missiles, long-range missiles, by the Houthis into Riyadh. What is the reaction of the Saudis? They continue to in a war in Saudi Arabia. What happened to the Iranians? Nothing. Israel will have to make the decision, which is a very complicated one, that if long-range missiles will be used by proxies of Iran to be launched against Israel, at the end of the day, Israel will have to react in Tehran. Otherwise, it will not be stopped. The Iranians are ready to sacrifice all the Lebanese and the Syrians in the war against Israel. I'm not sure that they are ready to get our retaliation in Tehran. And we should not make the mistake that the Saudis are doing. And it's well understood, everyone understands that the rockets which had been launched from Yemen are not the product of the Houthis industry. With all due respect to the Houthis, I mean. And we should not make the same mistake. I want to say something about this potential war. This potential war will be very devastating for us. Many missiles will launch into Israel. We build anti-missile systems which cost Israel at the end of the project will be somewhere between 10 to 15 billion dollars only to protect the homeland of Israel, the home front of Israel. But the war will have a very strong element of neutralizing the ability of Hezbollah and the Iranian to launch rockets and missiles into Israel. What does it mean? More than half of the 120,000 missiles and rockets deployed by the Iranians and Hezbollah within populated areas, in urban, very crowded areas. In some cases, the neighbors do not know about the missiles in the building nearby. The average heavy missile is between 200 to 600 kilogram of TNT. Add to that the fuel of the rocket, and think about the situation in which we have the information and we succeeded. We are, superpower cyber state, so we decided to bring 100 grams of TNT into this missile. But this 100 grams of TNT will explode the 600 kilogram of TNT, and all the fuel and everything will be in a crowded area in a building which is surrounded by many other buildings with innocent Lebanese people. What will happen in the surrounding area? What will be the collateral damage, not from our bomb? Our bomb will be only 100 grams of TNT. From the explosion of the missile with all the hundreds kilograms of TNT and the fuel. And think about 50,000 rockets and missiles like that spread all over urban populated areas in Lebanon. Thousands of Lebanese will be killed, many of them innocent. They don't know about the storage of these missiles and rockets in their surroundings. When I was in the National Security Council, I brought 2 people to my office and I briefed them about this issue and I showed them pictures of missiles and rockets in private houses. One was the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the other one was one of the highest officials of the Red Cross. And I said to both of them, gentlemen, this is the situation. I give you the most secret intelligence that we have. This missile supposed to launch into Haifa, this is to Jerusalem, this is to Tel Aviv. What we as Israelis supposed to do? And I told them the collateral damage will be devastating. I don't know to give numbers, I don't know how many Lebanese will be around these missiles when we launch our attack on them. Both didn't have an answer. And everyone here who is connected to the international community should be very loud about it. We are warning the world. We will not have any choice but to neutralize this capability of Hezbollah. The cost is very clear. Thousands of Lebanese will be killed. Whom to blame? Iran and the United Nations, who is doing nothing to stop this violence of the 1701 decision of the Security Council. None. UNIFIL does not exist practically. They didn't give even one report about one missile of Hezbollah since 2006. Not even one report, one rocket. If you read the reports, you might come to the conclusion that Hezbollah is a sport organization who is playing football in the morning, and nothing more than that. And this is the reality. This is the war that we are facing. It will be a devastating one. And what the world is doing to prevent it? Practically nothing. And at the end of the day, it will be in our shoulder, and this is why we have to build all the defensive systems which are needed to defend our home front, and at the same time to be prepared to all the screaming around the world while we are killing so many Lebanese, because so many of them will be killed. It doesn't matter how much effort the IDF will be to prevent collateral damage. It's not Gaza. We don't have the phone numbers of all these buildings in which there are missiles and rockets that we can call them and say, leave the house, what we can do in Gaza. We cannot do it all over Lebanon. We don't have the numbers. To sum it up, the world is fighting terrorism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth. We are fighting terror organizations which in many ways are military organizations or sub-countries. It's different situation. It is true about Lebanon. It is very true about Lebanon. It is true about Gaza, and it might be true if the Iranians will not be contained in Syria. It will be true about Syria, and we, as Israel, should have to take the risk to contain Iran in Syria. If the Iranians will have an independent war machine in Syria on top of the one that they have in Lebanon, it will be devastating for us. We cannot allow it to happen. Thank you very much.
want to thank General Amidror for what I consider to be a brilliant presentation because it discusses the realities on the ground. And we can't escape reality in this region. And it comes from a person who understands intelligence probably as good as any other Israeli does. I want to have a hand. Let's have a hand for General Amidror. Sorry to be so subjective because I agree with practically every word he says. So if I'm the MC, I'm going to have a good time. Okay, so now, basically, we have His Excellency Nickolay Mladenov here, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process of the United Nations. Mr. Mladenov of Bulgaria was appointed by the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as his Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and his personal representative to the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Palestine Authority in February 2015. In his capacity, Mr. Mladenov represents the Secretary General and leads the United Nations system in all political and diplomatic efforts related to the peace process, including the Middle East Quartet. He also coordinates the humanitarian and development work of the United Nations agencies and programs in the Palestinian territories in support of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian people. Mr. Mladenov brings with him extensive experience in public service and international affairs. In his last posting, he served as United Nations Secretary General's Special Representative for Iraq and head of the UN Assistance Mission for Iraq. He served as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria from 2010 to 2013 and Minister of Defense of Bulgaria from 2009 to 2010. Previously, he was member of the European Parliament from 2007 to 2009 and a member of the Parliament of Bulgaria from 2001 to 2005. Mr. Mladenov held several positions in the intergovernmental and non-governmental sectors, including at the World Bank and the European Institute in Sofia. From what we read in the newspapers around here and see on TV and see on the radio, Mr. Mladenov is working overtime, deserves overtime pay. He's all over the place. It's an extremely exciting period of time, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for that introduction. As you were introducing me, I was thinking that many people probably ask themselves, what exactly do I do? In the absence of a peace process, and what did I do that for my sins I get these jobs? I suppose it must be something that I did in my previous life. Thank you very much for having me here today. Professor Garon, Professor Reichman, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Once again, this forum has become one of the leading fora in the world for anti-terrorism, experts coming together from around the world to exchange ideas. And I know that yesterday, one of my colleagues from New York, Jahangir Khan, spoke also at this forum, and I'm looking forward to hearing my good friend and former Prime Minister, former boss, Boyko Borissov, the Prime Minister of Bulgaria, address this meeting today. When I looked at the program, I've often wondered about the use of the words counter in connection with terrorism or anti-connection with terrorism. I know that when people say anti-Semitism, anti-slavery, anti-racism, they mean that they want to abolish completely the phenomena of anti-Semitism, slavery, or racism. And I worry a little bit that when we say countering something, it sounds a little bit like a process. So I want to be very clear from the beginning of my presentation that as far as I'm concerned, our collective goal is not just to take action to prevent the effects of terrorism, but to eradicate it. And I think this is something that brings everyone together in this room. There will always be people who will make the case or who will argue that killing random civilians can be justified because of some noble goal, religious goal, political goal, whatever. But apart from these individual acts of terror that we face around the world, we should really focus on what are the conditions which create terrorism today. Where is the inspiration? Where's the motivation? Where is the political rationale for terrorism? Because people don't appear out of thin air, and they frequently originate from a network of very well organized and established religious, cultural, or political institutions, organizations with operational infrastructures and capacities, sometimes very closely compared to military establishments. Many of them have developed over the last few years and have grown and reinforced themselves across national borders and have infiltrated communication networks, social networks, everything. State sponsorship of terrorism and non-state actors also remains a highly complex challenge that we need to deal with today. Last year, when I attended the forum, I spoke briefly of what I believe is the necessity for a new international approach on how to deal with terrorism threats here in the Middle East. And I want to begin today by elaborating a little bit more on what, as far as I'm concerned, are the 5 main objectives of what we should do in the international system in order to support the fight against terrorism. And then I will, with your permission, speak very briefly about the situation in Gaza, which has kept me busy. I don't know if I should get overtime pay for that. Danger pay would certainly help. Our first task as the international community is really to affirm a very clear and moral clarity, to have very clear clarity on that we have zero tolerance, and we will have zero tolerance for the justification and legitimization of terrorism. And there are 2 aspects of this. One is the obligation of states under international law and what states should do, but then there's also the question of incitement. And let me start with that question first. We have an obligation not just to condemn acts of terror, but to stand up against those who condone them, who inspire them, and who celebrate them. And this is why you will hear very often Secretary General Guterres, myself, and others in the United Nations speak out clearly when such acts take place. To glorify terrorist attacks means to supply them with oxygen, to supply with oxygen the aspirations and to invite more attacks. And this is the reality which we face today. Political, social, and religious leaders have a strong responsibility, even if they don't actively promote terrorism in their speeches, to not be complicit with their silence, and not to create an environment that legitimizes and encourages terror. And I think this is quite valid for everywhere in the Middle East, and I'm sure many here in this auditorium will understand exactly where this argument is heading. But states also have obligations that are very clear and that have been defined in various UN Security Council resolutions and documents. I just give you an example, Resolution 1373, which is legally binding for all UN member states. And it says that governments have to prevent the commission of terrorist acts, ensure that their territory is not used for financing, planning, facilitating, or committing such acts, bring to justice and freeze the assets of those involved in such activities, and refrain from providing safe havens. Now that is what it says on paper. Of course, there are very significant gaps that still remain in how we implement many of the principles that have been defined in this respect in regard to the responsibilities of states. I just want to point out one whole area which I hope that your conference in the future will explore in greater detail, and that is the potential link between terror networks and organized crimes and smuggling around the world. I think that is a whole new area where we need to pay much more attention, much more closely than we have in the past. Our second obligation is to promote inclusive political solutions to conflicts. And this is where the role of the UN becomes critical. We must focus on delivery rather than process, and on people rather than bureaucracy. And we love bureaucracy and we love process. So we really need a new approach to how we do things. Our instruments, however, that we deal with have been designed in a previous era. They've mostly focused on state-to-state conflicts and not about conflicts within states or within ethno-religious communities. In the Middle East, these challenges are particularly visible today. we see different factors coming together at the same time. We see collapsing states and imploding social structures. We see the rise of religious radicalization. All of this very often prompted by outside interference, and all of it really creating a perfect storm that is engulfing the region. States, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, others, states that are unable to meet the legitimate demands of their people, demands for representation, for economic and social development, for security or for dignity, create space for radical groups to thrive, expand, and ultimately attack us around the world from there. In June of this year, the Secretary General made it very clear that we must come together to fight terrorism with methods that do not compromise the rule of law and human rights. International law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, does indeed guarantee freedom of expression. However, it very clearly also says that it brings with it duties and responsibilities. Duties and the responsibilities that include the respect of the rights and freedoms of others and the just requirement for public order and welfare, parts of the declaration that are rarely quoted in the media. Our third priority is to address the political and socio-economic factors that breed violent extremism. By this, I do not mean only that states need to invest in development, in protecting and upholding human rights and strengthening resilience of communities. I mean focusing on efforts that the underlying conditions of focusing on efforts to address the underlying conditions that have lured people to the agenda of radical extremists and terrorism. Marginalized communities, poverty, but more importantly, ideologies and the perception of injustice. This needs to be certainly addressed in today's interconnected world much more clearly than it has been in the past. But even all of this is not enough. We need to go further than that, and we need to focus on coordinating our efforts in the international arena to address these challenges much better than we have done in the past. And focus also on financing and illicit arms trafficking and accountability, on the use of social media and hate speech. These are areas where international tools, international documents, and coordination fora are still emerging. The threats we face come across borders, and that's why we need a multilateral approach. And this is where the UN should and must play a more clear role. And I want to assure you that Secretary General Antonio Guterres, since taking into office, has focused on this agenda very, very clearly. For the first time in June of last year, the UN hosted a high-level conference of the heads of counter-terrorist agencies from member states. In February, the Secretary General signed a compact with 36 UN entities to significantly improve the coordination of the UN system in supporting countries in countering and preventing terrorism. Also in June, the General Assembly, for the first time in its 6th biannual review of the global counter-terrorism strategy, for the first time condemned the use of human shields, a practice that is abhorrent and is often used by terrorists. These are just some examples, but this is only the beginning. Last on my list is a priority that I'm personally very fond of, and that is a priority, a political priority that we need to address very clearly. We need to focus on strengthening the forces of moderation. And this is a political objective, which is particularly valid here in the Middle East. And again, going back to communities, to social, political, and religious leaders, they have the power with their actions, their words, to refrain, to people, to encourage them to stand up to mistrust and tension. And they have a responsibility to uphold a more inclusive approach to society. Addressing the genuine grievances of people will also help us attack and counter the spreading of ideologies of radicalism. And I think this is perhaps in a way our first line of defense in this respect. Over the last few years, and this is where I really get excited when I look at the Middle East, and perhaps this is one of the justifications that gives me optimism, not just for my job, but for the region as a whole. Over the last few years, we've seen a growing understanding among leaders in some Arab countries of the need to focus on supporting moderation, strengthening the forces of moderation and standing up to radicalism. This is really a welcome development. It is a budding movement that needs to be supported and needs to be encouraged. And it could very easily become the basis of cooperation between Israel and its Arab neighbors, not just in the field of anti-terrorism, but in other areas as well. Of course, all of this is very theoretical, and I'd like to bring it a little bit closer to home to what we're doing on a daily basis here on the ground, perhaps upholding one of the most important aspects of the work of the UN today, and that is prevention, prioritizing prevention of conflicts rather than just responding to conflicts. In this context, we have, over the last few months, engaged in an unprecedented effort to prevent war in Gaza. This effort, which has succeeded for now because of the vital cooperation of all parties on the ground and in the region, exemplifies also many of the challenges that I spoke of earlier. The need for new instruments in dealing with conflicts, the requirement to focus on socio-economic drivers of conflicts and humanitarian issues, the essentiality of seeking political solutions and empowering moderates over radicals. Over the past couple of months, tension in Gaza, over the past few months actually, tension in Gaza has been rising rapidly. This is the result of a combination of a number of factors. The humanitarian situation has deteriorated as the economy has practically ground to a halt. A decade of Hamas control, Israeli closures, the measures taken by the Palestinian Authority, including the salary cuts that have affected some 20,000 people, the reduction of UNRWA services, and the fear that more cuts are coming breed anxiety and anger in the population. The constant lack of electricity, people live with about 3 hours of electricity per day, has led to a complete shutdown of the entire sewage system of 2 million people in Gaza and significantly reduced hospital services. Even as we speak today, we're about to be put in a situation in which the UN will no longer be in a position to provide fuel for hospitals because we've simply run out of money. The security situation has worsened. Over 170 people have been killed in protests at the fence and thousands injured. The security situation in Israel along the border with Gaza has also deteriorated with the advent of incendiary kites and balloons and other devices. Provocations at the fence, shooting incidents, and barrages of rockets coming out of Gaza, IDF responding to that, have brought us to the verge of war at least 3 times in the course of the last 2 months. This is a war that nobody needs and a war that everybody must work together to avoid. The political situation has also worsened as Egyptian-led reconciliation talks between Hamas and Fatah have ground to a halt and efforts to return Gaza under the control of the Palestinian Authority have stalled. So the combination of these humanitarian, political, and security factors is really a recipe for disaster, a disaster that nobody needs and nobody wants, considering all the other security threats that were outlined earlier in this conference. Unless the international community, in coordination with the Palestinian Authority, with the government of Israel, with Egypt, acts immediately, the humanitarian, political, and security crisis will rapidly escalate and risk a military confrontation that will have devastating consequences for a population of 2 million people that has gone through 3 devastating conflicts already in the last decade. Rather than wait for what seems to be an inevitable conflict, this time we decided that we want to try and to prevent it, not just deal with the fallout. The effort that the UN has undertaken has been supported by a number of member states in the UN, by the Security Council. I brief them regularly in open and closed consultation, by the Secretary General, who has called on all parties to cooperate with us. Our goals have been very clearly defined. First, to reduce the risk of military confrontation with potential regional implications in Gaza. Second, to support Egyptian efforts to achieve reconciliation and the return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza. And thirdly, to address all humanitarian issues. We have engaged with all sides to restore calm and sustain the 2014 ceasefire arrangements. This is necessary to address all humanitarian issues and revive the efforts to empower the government. We work together very closely and foremost with the Egyptian government and authorities, with Israeli and Palestinian authorities, with all parties on the ground to ensure that peace stands a chance. All sides, however, must do their part to ensure that this process succeeds. And that includes also improving movement and access restrictions and upgrading electricity and water supplies for Gaza. Over the last few weeks, I've read much speculation in the media, and I've heard so many conspiracy theories as to what exactly is going on in Gaza that it does give me a headache sometimes. But I remember I come from the Balkans, and we're not easily scared by rumors, by fake news and conspiracies. We have a lot of those in our own world. So today, in the world of broken mirrors that the Middle East is, I felt that it was important for me to clarify what is the reality of what the UN and our partners are doing. Hopefully, by doing this, address what is not the reality. And the reality is that we need to work day in and day out to sustain calm today in Gaza. It is not business as usual. Nobody should consider this to be business as usual. The old ways will no longer be working. To sustain calm, Palestinians in Gaza need to see some progress in their lives. Increased electricity supply, functioning hospitals, reduced movement and access restrictions, economic activity. Israeli communities near Gaza need to see progress as much as Palestinians. They need to see an immediate end to the incendiary attacks, to the kites and to the balloons, to the terror attacks of rockets and mortars. Without this calm, which is only based on the 2014 ceasefire arrangements, without this calm, the whole plethora of humanitarian issues that have been raised both by all sides connected to Gaza cannot be resolved. Without this calm, the Egyptian government and the Egyptian effort to make progress on the return of the PA back to Gaza will not be possible. Without this calm, it is difficult to address the broader political aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including the two-state outcome that still remains the core of what the international community wants to achieve in order to ensure that the sustainability of peace here between Israel and Palestine. But let me be very clear about one thing, and with this I will end. For prevention work, whether it is in this conflict or anywhere else in the world, to work, we need all parties to cooperate, to do their part. Throughout the past 2 months, in parallel to Egyptian and UN efforts to restore calm, there have been attempts to undermine our efforts, to bring Israel and Hamas into a confrontation. We must not allow these efforts to succeed. We must continue to persevere very, very strongly. This is, ladies and gentlemen, the precarious nature of our work today. This is what keeps us in my office awake late at night, dealing with all of these challenges. And I hope that if we succeed with the cooperation of everyone to prevent another escalation in the south, this will have a positive implication, positive result for Israelis, for Palestinians, for the political process, for the lives of people who are sick and tired of the dangers that they live in, and hopefully would allow the region to focus on where the real challenges to the future of its own security and prosperity lie. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to address the conference today, and I look forward to the rest of our discussions. Thank you.
Your Excellency, on behalf of all of us, we wish you the very best of luck in all of the hard work and hope that there are some good results. You've got your hands full. Demands a tremendous amount of perseverance. At least we know you come from a country where the king saved the Jews in World War II. That gives us a little bit of confidence, I think. It's a statement. And who knows what's going to be. Very, very difficult formulas here. A lot of what you're discussing here has been discussed at the conference, a lot of the ramifications. And I think it's a privilege for us that you were able to come here because really everything you're working with and about is making headlines right now. And this is basically where the action is. So thank you for being with us, because we know you have other things to do. And your success, by the way, is our success. So please succeed. It's important. I have another message to give you. And that is that the Prime Minister of Bulgaria will be addressing us at 6:30 in the evening, and not during this session. This session will now end with Gilles de Kerchove speaking about what he's going to speak about. And 15 minutes after, and after he completes his deliberations here, we're going to go into a cocktail. When we come back here around 6:30, and when we welcome the Prime Minister of Bulgaria, I will be asking all of you to rise. So don't be surprised by that. Okay, please cooperate with us. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Gilles de Kerchove, who was appointed EU Counter-Terrorism Coordinator on the 19th of September 2007. In this function, he coordinates the work of the European Union in the field of counter-terrorism, maintains an overview of all the instruments at the Union's disposal, closely monitors the implementation of the EU counter-terrorism strategy, and fosters better communication between the EU and third countries to ensure that the Union plays an active role in the fight against terrorism. He was previously Director for Justice and Home Affairs at the EU Council General Secretariat and Deputy Secretary of the Convention, which drafted the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Before that, he was head of the private office of the Deputy Prime Minister of the Federal Government of Belgium, Minister of Justice and Minister of Economic Affairs, and head of the private office of the Deputy Prime Minister of the Federal Government of Belgium, Minister of Justice. And he is a professor of European law at the Université Catholique de Louvain, at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and at the University Saint-Louis Bruxelles. He has published a number of books on European law, human rights, security, counterterrorism. He's got what it takes. Floor is yours.
Many thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored, I'm very pleased to be here for the third time. In the 12 years I've been in the job, someone made the point that I have been for very long in this very odd job, and my answer is that probably no one wants to see me doing something else, or no one wants to take my job, one of the two. I have 15 minutes just before the cocktail for explaining a bit the challenges the EU is faced with. And I will start by saying, having been 12 years in this position, that I'm impressed by what the EU has achieved the last 3 or 4 years. Of course, prompted and driven by events, but the way the EU has invested and increased its policy in the field of internal security is pretty impressive. And I must confess that the quality of the conversation is much more interesting than before. This being said, I just want to list some of the challenges where I see we need to do a lot more and we have to address. The first is, but that has been explained, I'm sure, during the day and a half which has already taken place, is the diversity and the complex nature of the threat. When I was appointed, in a way, I wouldn't say it was easy, but we were confronted to one organization, Al-Qaeda, with different branches and franchises, and we were in the hundreds. Now we have many different types of threat. The first has been mentioned several times during these 2 days, homegrown, which leads the head of MI5 to speak of a real shift and not a spike in the change. People who have not traveled to Syria and Iraq, people who have no direct link with the organization, neither Daesh or AQ, but are just inspired and self-radicalized. The challenge here is first the number. Difficult to assess the number, and our member states don't quote often figures, but from the 3 largest member states, we can assess that they have identified, by and large, nearly 20,000 people at some stage of radicalization in the UK, in Germany, and in France. So the first question is, how can we detect signs of radicalization as early as possible? Through community policing, through training better frontliners, by using hotlines, by more and more using big data analytics. But this being said, since being radical is not a crime in itself, the biggest challenge is to determine what I call the tipping point. It's where someone radical start preparing to mount an attack and falls into violence. And this is a real challenge. If one looks at most of the terrorist attacks in recent months and years in Europe, most of the time our services knew the person. I'm the last one to criticize what they did, but very often the problem was they didn't draw the right conclusions and didn't determine exactly the tipping point, which has recently led the UK government to change a bit the approach in the new iteration of the strategy contest and try to bring and share more intelligence much more widely. MI5 has always been very protective and rightly so of the intelligence collected, and more will share at local level. So homegrown. The second one is the returnees, the legacy of the caliphate. In Europe, and it's very impressive, we've had by and large 5,000 plus of our citizens who went to join Daesh. 1,500 already returned. We know that 1,000, a bit more than 1,000 have been killed, and therefore we have a stock of 2,500 which have either been killed but were not aware. In some battle in Raqqa and Mosul, many have been killed but not identified. Some are still fighting. Some already managed to leave for another hotspot. One has mentioned Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, probably the Sinai. Some may have already moved to Turkey, and some are detained. Here again, challenge to spot them when they return, and it's not very easy. Many can use false genuine passport, and recently in Bulgaria, by the way, very efficiently, the border authority managed to identify a Moroccan traveling with a Syrian passport. The second challenge is to bring them to justice, which raised the question of getting the evidence. Not very easy in many member states to prove and provide the evidence that the people were fighting alongside Daesh or Jabhat al-Nusra. Most of the time, the only evidence available are digital evidence, but with the problem that many of these digital evidence are stored in clouds in the United States, in California, which requires MLA procedure. It's lengthy and cumbersome. We are working on it. And most importantly, manage to get access to battlefield evidence. But there is a culture that we try to change in the army to keep that secret for too long. And the question is, how can we bring that information at the border in real time? The third one is assess the dangerousness of those who return. When you don't have enough evidence to secure a conviction, you need to assess the dangerousness and, if need be, to monitor them 24/7, but it's pretty resource consuming. And finally, disengage those who can be disengaged. So homegrown, returnees. The third one, and I mentioned that, those detained in Syria and Iraq. We have nearly 60 of our citizens detained by the SDF in northern Syria. They cannot hold them forever. We have 1,400 children who were born in Iraq and Syria or who went there with their parents, and 666 women. It's not a secret that our member states are not extremely keen to see some of the detainees coming, sometimes for lack of evidence. And the question is, will our member states and will the European Union be proactive to bring them back home? The fourth category is what I would call the prison leavers, people who have served their sentence but are still very radical when they leave prison. If one looks only at France, the French Minister of Justice mentioned 450 detainees who will be released by end 2019, who are highly radicals. 50 have been sentenced for terrorism, and 400 are just got radicalized in prison. What do? They have served their sentence. You can develop a disengagement program, but probably other measures may should be taken. Electronic bracelet, regular reporting to the police, compulsory disengagement program, but this will be a growing challenge for member states. And the last category, which I do hesitate to mention because it's very marginal, but has a huge public impact, is of course some of the refugees who were exposed to the Daesh ideology, who have lived in the Daesh-controlled territory, who just get radicalized in Europe because it's not that easy to integrate in our society, who are more vulnerable and are trying to be recruited by some Salafist organization in Europe and may fall into violence. My last point on the threat, and then turning to the policy response, and I'd like to mention is what I call the black swan. I'm very, very impressed by the fact that in 2011, President Obama decided to withdraw the American troops from Iraq because at the time, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was nearly destroyed. 3 years later, a guy called Baghdadi proclaimed the caliphate in 2014, attracting 4,000 fighters from more than 100 countries in the world. How is it that we have not seen the rise of probably the strongest terrorist organization in the world when the Americans left Iraq? And will we see another black swan coming? Are we, do we have developed the forecast and are we in a position to identify the looming threat? It's a question. Will we see a Daesh 2.0? I was recently in Ramadi in the Al-Anbar province meeting the sheikh who supported the rise of Daesh because they were very upset by the very sectarian policy of the previous Prime Minister of Iraq, Maliki. Their message was very clear. Unless we get very quickly a better education, we rebuild the country, we get jobs and support, we will express our disappointment in one way or another. Will we see the merge of AQ and Daesh? One of the best experts on AQ, Ali Soufan, suggested that it, not for the time being, but at some stage the two organizations might get closer to each other, if not merge, because the three reasons, he says, which explain the split between Jabhat al-Nusra and Daesh have nearly disappeared. The first was an ego problem between al-Zawahiri and Baghdadi. The second, when should we set up the caliphate? Should it be straight away? That was the plan of Daesh, and Al-Qaeda see it as a long-term goal, and the use of violence to impose the ideology and Sharia. So this, and we see more and more in the propaganda of AQ the rise of Hamza bin Laden, which is much more ecumenic and may push for that. So in terms of policy challenges, I will be a bit telegraphic, but there are several ways we need to invest more. The first is, of course, prevent. Counter-violent extremism, or PVE, you name the way you want. In terms of disengagement program, we have started working, or member states have started developing some of them. Inside prison, outside prison, I think we're not there yet. And there is a huge need to invest a lot more in this field. The second is internet, and that was mentioned just before me. We've been working hard. We've set up in Europe a public-private partnership with the big internet companies so as they can remove much more quickly illegal content. We want them to remove that within an hour. We are making progress, but the European Commission will, in the coming weeks, I think, table a draft legislation. I understand Israel has done the same, but the draft is still pending in Parliament. It is a difficult exercise because you have to strike the right balance between free speech and that sort of measures. What maybe should be done more is on the way Google and similar search engines are working, because they tend to create echo chamber in which people are trapped, and that requires some response. We have to do a lot more of mainstreaming of counter-violent extremism, I believe, in Europe, in other policies like education, culture, sport, media, access to jobs, and the Commission is very determined to do that. So CV is one. The second one is, of course, information sharing. The first lesson that the Americans drew after 9/11, where they saw the need to connect the dots. When I'm interviewed on the weaknesses in Europe, most of the time journalists are expecting me to criticize the lack of information sharing in Europe. That was most likely, no, probably that was the case some years ago, but we've made a lot of progress, and our member states, security service, intelligence service, and law enforcement agencies are now feeding the different EU database a lot. They're exchanging a lot. So my point is not much that we're not sharing enough. The two challenges in terms of creating a genuine information sharing environment, it's more on how can we collect more data in the first place, because you can only share what you have collected in the first place. And the second one is, what do you do with all this data that you have collected and shared? In terms of collection, here we have two serious problems, and not easy to solve. The first one is the growing expectation for privacy and data protection in Europe. This is taken very seriously, and this leads the European Parliament, as well as the European Court of Justice, to be extremely vigilant so that we strike the balance right. But that leads to some problems, because there are some data we need, but we cannot always collect or retain for long. The other one is encryption. As we know, these terrorists were using and are still using social network encrypted, and except in some cases, because it's quite expensive, it's not that easy to get access to content. And so far, the only way to compensate for the non-access to the content, because it was encrypted, was to get access to what is called metadata, i.e. the information that our service providers collect on who sent the mail to whom at what time, who called whom at what time, and so forth. But our Court of Justice, because of privacy concern, decided that the EU legislation in terms of access to and retention of metadata was violating our fundamental rights of privacy and data protection. So in a way, we have a serious problem to solve in Europe, because we cannot get access to the content because of encryption, and at the same time, less and less get access to metadata. And as the Americans say, some of our services are going dark. So collection is one. The other one is what to do with all this data. It's nice to collect more. It's nice to share more, but many services complain because they are confronted to what they call a tsunami of data. And the French have a very good way to put it. They call that infobesity. We are fat because of too much data. And as I've said, in many instances, we had the data, but we failed to analyze the data properly. And so a big challenge for all of our services, and again, I'm not criticizing, is to improve the skill of analyzing data. One way the French are doing that, and I really find that very smart, is to enrich the recruitment and the profile of the people they recruit in the intelligence services. Not only police officers with the same training, going to the same school, but psychologists, ethnologues, specialists in IT, and so forth. The other one is the idea launched by the French President Macron to create in Europe an intelligence agency, a European Intelligence Academy, to train all analysts, to bring them together and train them together. And on that front, I had a very interesting discussion here in Israel, because I understand the Shin Bet went through that process some years ago. The third one is high tech. That was alluded to by Boaz Ganor in his speech yesterday evening. My concern is more and more that a lone actor can know, because he can easily sometimes get access to high tech, can mount an attack with catastrophic consequences. Cyber terrorism one day, not for the time being, but I would not be surprised if it does happen before 5 years. Miniaturization, 30 grams of explosive is enough to blow up a plane. Drones, CBRN threat, synthetic bio, and so forth. This is the disruptive technologies have a lot of potential, and more our services do use them. Just I mentioned before big data analytics. More and more our services are using big data analytics to detect suspicious behavior and process big data. Blockchain, I believe we would be well inspired to explore to what extent blockchain could help address the problem of hawala, remittance, and the way to finance terrorism. But at the same time, it is these disruptive technologies carry some risk and create some vulnerabilities, not to mention artificial intelligence. And I'm not sure we have assessed all the potential risks that they could create. We see the risk of deep fake technologies, but quantum computing, Internet of Things, cyber jihad, and cyber terrorism could potentially create additional problems. Then we have two problems. The first, the internal security community in Europe, unlike the defense community, has not really a culture of forward-looking. Just because they are mobilized by day-to-day challenges, they are investing a bit less in forecasting and forward-looking. And one of the challenges is to bring them more together and look at their needs and be in a position to express their need. Europe has earmarked a lot of money to encourage security-related research, but that requires that the professional be in a position to express their need. Finally, public-private partnership. Here again, that was not so far really the culture in Europe. It is developing in the field of terrorist financing, in the field of internet, and I mentioned the Internet Forum, and for the protection of public space, where the Commission has set up a very effective public-private forum. But it has to happen a lot more. And finally, and that's my last point, when I started 12 years ago, not a single euro was invested to support third state in their effort to fight against terrorism. Now we are putting a lot of money, a lot of expertise. We're engaged a lot with our neighbor, and especially our neighbor, because we believe they need a lot of support, because it's our first line of defense. We need to do that a lot more, find the right way to address their need, promote rule of law, good governance, as was said by the previous speakers, address the grievances is very important. The UNDP produces a very interesting report that I encourage you to read, Journey to Africa, which explains really why terrorism and radicalization is on the rise in Africa, probably the next jihad battleground. And Europe is very engaged in development and security. Other challenge externally will be our relationship with our British colleague when they leave. It's a key member state in the fight against terrorism, and it is important to keep a very close relationship with our British friend when they will leave. It is currently discussed in Brussels. And finally, the transatlantic cooperation. I've been working on this for the last 25 years, and I've never seen such an intimate and close relationship, and it's important to keep it very alive. So these are some of the challenges we are faced with, but the main message that I want to convey is really the determination. I think the EU institution got the message from our citizens when they are asked where they would like to see more Europe. In all the recent polls, instead of mentioning just unemployment, 82% of the citizens would like to see more Europe in the field of security. And I think the President of the Commission, the President of the European the Council got the message, and the EU institutions are really very active in investing in all this. I thank you very much for your attention.
Terrific. The EU now has to fix things too. Okay, so Gilles, I want to thank you very much for your presentation. It's great to have you a third time here, a veteran speaker at this conference, and thanks for sharing. We are now going to break for 45 minutes, And we will come back here promptly. We'll be sitting in these chairs at 6:30 in order to greet the Prime Minister of Bulgaria. Thank you very much.